It is my pleasure today to introduce Dr. Connie Roser-Renouf. She is a research consultant recently retired from the Center for Climate Change Communication at George Mason University. Her research focuses on understanding how diverse audiences use, interpret, and respond to information on climate change. Between 2008 and 2018, Dr. Roser-Renouf served as co-principal investigator of the Yale George Mason University Audience Research Program, Climate Change in the American Mind, which tracks public opinion about climate change in the US. She currently teaches climate change communication for health professionals through the School of Public Health at Yale and consults on research for NASA's climate change education website. Please welcome Dr. Connie Roser-Renouf.
Good morning, and thank you all for coming. And I'm going to share my slides with you. Is that working?
Yes, it is.
Everything okay, Alexia? Looks
Yeah.
right?
Yeah,
Great.
It's all good.
Great. Okay. So I am going to talk to you today about how we connect with audiences, how we engage audiences, and some strategies that you can use in order to reach and engage the people who you want to communicate with on climate change. An overview of the talk is, first we're going to talk about understanding your audience, because if we begin from where we are and what we want to say and don't take into consideration what the audience already thinks and feels about climate change, we're not likely to connect. We need to start from their perspective in order to really be able to reach and influence them. We're going to talk about the informational needs of groups of people who have different beliefs about climate change and how likely they are to process information that we have, what they're likely to do with the information that we want to share with them. And then we're going to talk about specific strategies for communicating the risks of climate change based on audience characteristics. Basically, there are social marketing strategies from the research on persuasion and information campaigns that can be used to engage audiences who aren't concerned about climate change. I'm going to give you the magic bullet that will change all people who are skeptical about climate change into true believers. In fact, I wish I were able to do that. I wish that existed. It is very difficult to reach and influence people who are skeptical about climate change, but there are strategies that may be effective, and we'll talk about that. And then finally, we'll talk about the audiences that are concerned about climate change, who are who are alarmed about it, and how we can engage them in order to get them to take more aggressive action to reduce climate change. So first off, this first topic, the key to effective communication, understanding your audience. The work that I'm going to talk to you about is grounded in audience segmentation research that Mason and Yale have been collaborating on since 2007, when we first segmented the American public into global warming's 6 Americas. These 6 audiences range along a spectrum from the alarmed to the dismissive. The spectrum, the range is in terms of at one end among the alarmed, the greatest acceptance of the reality and danger of climate change, the greatest recognition that there is a scientific consensus that this is human caused and dangerous, down to the other end of the dismissive, who are pretty firmly convinced that it's not happening and it's likely to be a hoax. And with each step, with each group, as you move from the left to the right, there is less understanding and less acceptance of the science of climate change. These 6 groups we've been tracking since 2007, 2008. This is how they looked in December of 2020. The two patterns in the data that are going to be essential for us in terms of understanding how we communicate on climate change. The first is, as I've just described, moving from the alarm to the dismissive. There's a straight monotonic decrease in understanding, attitude change, beliefs, attitudes, concern. That plays out also in support for policies to mitigate climate change, in personal actions to reduce climate change, and intentions to take actions to reduce climate change. The second pattern, which is really important for communication and which people tend to be less aware of, is this curvilinear relationship relating to issue involvement, that for the alarmed and the dismissive, this is a topic that they think about, they care about, they pay attention to what's there in the news. But the groups in the middle, this just is not on their radar, particularly the disengaged. They are not involved with the issue, they don't pay attention to it, they don't retain information. And that makes for certain challenges in terms of reaching them that we're going to discuss today. The literature on persuasion, attitude change, information processing, coming out of both psychology and communication and political science, gives us strategies that can be used by, we're going to lump the 6 groups. They are all different from each other, but for the purposes of this talk, we're going to lump them into 3 groups where there are major literatures out there telling us about how we can communicate with those groups to the groups. So we're going to combine the alarmed and concerned. And I want you to notice that this is in the US, over 50% of the population at this point are in those 2 groups. This has been increasing gradually since 2015. The middle groups that just are not thinking about this, that it's not an issue that concerns them, they're not skeptical about it so much as they just don't have any opinions on it. That's about 1/4 of the population. And then we have about 20% of the population who are skeptical. And an important distinction between the doubtful and dismissive are 2 skeptical audiences. The dismissive are firmly in holding the belief that this is not real. The doubtful are persuadable. They are likely to be convinced strongly to believe that humans can't cause climate change. It could be happening. Yeah, it could be happening. But if it is happening, it's just natural changes because it's hubris to think that humans could affect the climate. So we're going to talk about those 3 groups. And this pattern that we found with the 6 Americas has been replicated in a number of other developed Western nations. But it does not hold for the developing nations. The one segmentation we have of India, the segments look entirely different. So if you're in a developing nation, this is not so applicable to you. However, if you are in Canada, this same pattern holds in Canada. Magnuson segmented Canadians in 2016. And what you see are similar proportions to what I just showed you in terms of having 60% of the population in those 2 concerned and alarmed segments, the people who care about climate change. I want to show you though, just for comparison, at the same time that this segmentation in Canada was conducted, in the US, if you look, the Canadians are way ahead of the US. And I don't have more recent data for Canada, but I'm guessing those of you who are there would say, yes, Canada is probably still ahead of the US in terms of concern about climate change. But so we're going to talk about these 3 groups: the group that is engaged, the group that is unconcerned, and the group that are skeptical about climate change. We're going to talk about what kinds of information they need, how we deliver it to them, and I'm going to stop here to see if there are any questions so far.
So we do have one question from Sarah Farley-Gelinas, and she asks, through your various audiences, do you have different personas that you segment for different communication tactics based on different elements that characterize them, such as age, gender, and education?
We have not segmented based on demographic characteristics. However, we have data, and I would be happy to share that like after the talk with anyone who is interested on the demographic characteristics of the segments. I can tell you just right off that the disengaged tend to have lower socioeconomic status than the other segments. And this makes perfect sense if you are working to pay the rent and are concerned about day-to-day survival. Climate change can feel like a very distant issue. Conversely, what we also see is that that people of color tend to be more concerned and more engaged than whites are, and that the dismissive segment is heavily populated by older white men. And I'm guessing that most of you could guess that without me even saying that. But yeah, if you want more detailed information on the demographic characteristics of the groups, I can share those data. And just generally, when you are communicating with any particular audience, you want sources that are trusted by that particular group, and also sources that look like that group in order to reach them more effectively.
So we have one more question or comment that just showed up, and it's Clement asking, the graph that you showed with the two lines, belief and issue engagement, looks like the Dunning-Kruger effect diagram, albeit with an inverted y-axis. Would you say this is a relevant effect?
I'm sorry, but I don't know that.
I think the Dunning-Kruger effect is the one about like the more, you know, there's an amount of knowledge that you have about a topic. And if you know just a little bit, you think you know a lot. And if you know a lot about a topic, then suddenly you question your own beliefs and you start doubting it.
Well, yes, I can tell you that I don't know that that's reflected in this chart, but the dismissive think that they know a lot about climate change. Yes, they do. Yeah, they don't, but they think they do.
Thank you. That was our last question for the moment.
Okay. All right, so informational needs and information processing propensities. We're going to look at understanding of the threat of climate change. And this is from a very old model from Kim Whitty, but it works really well in terms of understanding risk perceptions and how people respond to perceived threats. So people first consider, when they're presented with a threat, the danger associated with that threat, and then the actions that they can take to reduce the threat. And danger then has two dimensions to it. How bad is this? How severe is it? And am I vulnerable? And then actions to reduce the threat have two dimensions also. Will this action be effective in reducing the threat? And is it feasible? Is it something that I can actually do? So the process, this is a multi-stage information processing kind of model. First, there's the recognition of the threat, and then perceptions of vulnerability. And this has generally been applied historically to personal threats, so let's say smoking, drunk driving, wearing your seatbelt, breast cancer. But we're applying it more generally, and we run into a roadblock here in terms of perceived vulnerability, because for many of us, the vulnerability, we apply it more broadly to people and other species who are not necessarily close to home. But for many of our audiences, the fact that I am not personally vulnerable, I don't feel vulnerable, is a barrier. However, when people do recognize that there is a threat and that they have a sense of vulnerability, it generates fear in the model. We can think of this more like worry, concern than actual terror, but there needs to be a feeling, an emotion of concern, and in order to motivate the next step. If that doesn't happen, I don't think this is bad, I don't feel particularly vulnerable, people then tend to disregard the threat and move on, and they don't pay attention to it subsequently. For those, however, who make the step to feeling worried, then they look to the actions that they can take to reduce the threat. Is this action effective, and can I do it? And you think about smoking, that's where the block is. Yes, I could improve my health if I quit smoking. However, I just can't do it. I'm an addict and it's just really hard to quit. And people get stuck at that point. But if people understand that there is something they can do that will help, and they feel capable of doing it, then they engage in danger control, which is I reduce the threat by taking the action that is being recommended. If I fail to feel that there is an effective response, or that the response will not be effective, then I act in a way to control my fear. That is, I put blinders on. I rationalize to myself, oh, they're exaggerating. It isn't really as bad as they say it is. I distort the message. I forget the message. I engage in all sorts of cognitive strategies that will help me to feel less afraid in the face of a threat that I feel that I can't reduce the threat. So with our audiences, the doubtful and dismissive have yet to realize that this is a dangerous threat. Our cautious and disengaged groups have yet to develop a sense of vulnerability that makes them feel concerned. And for our alarmed and concerned, they're down at the next level, that some of them are engaged in danger control. But the barrier that we want to talk about in terms of communicating with them is there are a large number of them who feel like there isn't anything I can do that's going to make a difference. And in order to get them to act, we need to give them things to do that they perceive both to be effective and feasible, in order to get them to take more action than they currently are. Now, coming out of that, then we can think about the kinds of information that people in our segments need. The people who are alarmed and concerned about about climate change overwhelmingly want to hear about solutions. We've asked about this repeatedly, and what they want to know is, what can I do? What can my country do? What can the world do? Is this a solvable problem? If so, how do we solve it? The people who are less concerned don't want. What we need to share with them, what they need, is information that makes the threat real for them. And at the same time, because we don't want them to be engaging in then fear control, we need to pair information about the threat with information about solutions. And you'll notice with at the bottom here, I've made the figure so that the segments overlap, that they're not entirely discrete. There's overlapping between the segments. That there are some of the concerned and a lot of the doubtful who will profit from hearing about both threat and solutions. And then finally, for our skeptics, we want to provide them with information on conservative solutions to climate change. A lot of what they fear is not climate change impacts, but the climate change solutions, which they think are going to interfere with free market and the economy. And so they reject the science because they reject the solutions. And we also want to talk to them about co-benefits, because there is so much with climate change that if we address it, it benefits the society more broadly in so many different ways. So that's the kind of information that we want to provide to the groups in order to engage them more with the issue. So let me stop here for just another minute and see if there are questions at this point.
So yes, we have a question, although I feel like you might have answered some of it, but I'll ask you anyways, from Amandine. And she asks, do you think that people can change categories when they're given knowledge and they have more concern about climate change, or maybe not change radically, but just go from skepticism to being concerned, or from being concerned to being fully aware?
Yes, Alexia, just one more time, the first sentence of that, I didn't quite get.
Okay. The question is, can people change which category they're in if they're given
yes.
more knowledge, more information?
Yes, absolutely. We see change constantly. And since when the recession happened in 2008, we saw a big drop in concern about climate change. And it stayed pretty low for a pretty long time. And then in 2015, what we started to see, there were a number of things that happened. Obama's Clean Power Plan, the Pope's encyclical on climate change. There were, as there have been, climate disasters, hurricanes, fires, and protests about drilling in the Arctic. And we started to see in 2015 an uptick of the public moving toward the alarmed and concerned segments. And that has continued steadily since then. We have more people concerned about climate change now than we have since going back to like 2007 and when Al Gore published An Inconvenient Truth before the recession. We are ahead now of where we have ever been in terms of the proportion of the public that is very concerned about climate change. So yes, there is change. Thank goodness.
Next, we have a comment and then a couple more questions. The comment is from Remy Tario. We probably don't want to create too much eco-anxiety, such as to cause action paralysis. So providing solutions and encouraging action should help lessen eco-anxiety.
Yes, exactly. We will be talking about that quite a bit.
Perfect.
Yeah.
The next question is from Hugh White. How do you target these groups with the correct information and medium without using demographic characteristics of each group?
We look for the middle segments, and I'm going to hold off on answering that because I do answer it later on, but we have not targeted using demographics. We have targeted based on which media channels audiences in each of those groups typically use. And so just for example, if I'm trying to reach the alarmed, I'm going to use channels like the Sierra Club, specialized newsletters. If I'm going to try to reach the doubtful and dismissive, I'm going to go to conservative news sources. And those middle segments, we're going to use mass media in a nutshell.
Thank you. The next question is from Clément Mangin, who's asking if there is a group that's farther to the right that is not only dismissive, but also actively fighting the mainstream narrative as a conspiracy, and this group wouldn't be convinced ever by any alternative framing.
That's pretty much how I would describe the dismissive. Yeah. They tend to be a very loud group. There is a common perception that there are many more of them out there than there actually are because they are so loud.
Right. A last question from Tatiana Gordine. Is an example of conservative solution, is the carbon tax an example of conservative solution?
Yes.
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 And I think that is it for our questions now. Thank you very much.
All right. Okay, so let's talk about communicating. Now, it just is so easy, right? This is the information deficit model. This is the model that we all tend to start with intuitively because it just makes so much sense. People need to understand how bad this is. We want to tell them this is really important. So we just tell them how bad it is, and then their attitudes will change, and then their behaviors change. A very logical sequence from knowledge to attitudes to behavior. And this is the model that communicators have been using for forever because it just intuitively makes so much sense. And over and over and over again, it fails. And it fails because of motivations and ability and social norms within our tribes. So first of all, motivations. I'm not interested. I don't want to hear about this. I selectively choose information that is consistent with what I already believe or what I want to believe. And if I do get exposed to your information, I can use motivated reasoning, that is faulty logic, that will allow me to dismiss your argument or your information and call it biased, exaggerated, the product of a huge conspiracy among scientists and so on. Ability is also a barrier. And I'll show you some data on that in just a second. And finally, social norms. Oh, I hear your message and gee, that sounds right. And then I talk to other people in my group and find out none of them think that's the case. And I go along with the group. And all of those are reasons that this just simple model of we teach, they learn, they change is likely to fail. These are old data, but I think they still are applicable. These are the proportions of each segment who agree with the statement. I have difficulty understanding news reports about global warming. And this is the what you see here is the proportion in each segment who agree with that statement. Look at the disengaged, fully 3/4 of them say they have a hard time understanding the information. So this is the matter of ability, that even among the alarmed, you see 1/4 of them, close to 1/4, say that it's hard for them to understand information. And then in terms of motivation, I don't want to hear about it. You see majorities of the disengaged, the doubtful, and the dismissive all say they don't want to hear about global warming. So those are the kinds of barriers that we are facing in terms of trying to reach people. There's the second lit up. Now this curvilinear relationship with issue involvement among the segments is really important. It's central in terms of communicating. Let me show you here the data going back to our first segmentation when we first identified this. How much had you thought about global warming before today? And there is the curve that I've just showed you, that from the alarmed down to the disengaged, back up to the dismissive. And notice that, so the disengaged are somewhere here between not at all and only a little in terms of how much they've thought about it. But keep in mind that on a survey, people are not so, there's a pressure to say, oh yeah, I think about it. So these are even inflated estimates, likely, of how much people are thinking about global warming. And the corollary then to that is this flip that we see in the curve in agreement with, I could easily change my mind about global warming. What that tells me is these groups in the middle, they get exposed to something and they, oh, okay, right. But they don't retain it. They forget. The next thing that they come across about climate change may be a completely different point of view. And they'll, oh, okay, that's right. But they're not paying enough attention. They're not thinking about it or processing information deeply enough in order to retain it and really change their minds. And that's the barrier that we face in terms of influencing and engaging that middle segment, the middle segments. How can we get them to retain? How can we make our messages stick so that people actually experience a change that moves them to the alarmed or concerned segment? So just in brief, the alarmed and concerned are paying attention to the information that is provided on climate change. The groups in the middle are ignoring that information, not doing much of anything with it, not retaining it. And the doubtful and dismissive are engaged in counter-arguing and in message distortion. Any questions here?
So yes, we do have questions. One is from Clément again. Studies have shown that framing climate change as a threat to national security has an observable positive effect on conservatives' attitudes. I'm not sure if it's efficient against individualism, which slightly differs from conservatism. Do you know of a framing that would help against individualist ideologies?
Yes, and I'll give you an example of that in an experiment in the next part of the talk. Yes, but again, there are no magic bullets. We've also done an experiment with national security framing where it backfired and it just made the dismissives mad. But you know, that framing is likely to be effective with the doubtful. No framing that I know of is going to just be the magic bullet that reaches all the dismissive and changes all of their minds. Yeah.
A second question is from Alexandria. She's asking, when engaging younger generations through education, such as students in elementary and high school, what would you suggest to avoid students to prevent students from developing the anxiety of alarm, as well as the opposite, which is being completely dismissive?
Boy, I am not someone who is involved in formal education of young people, so I don't know that I am the person to answer that question. But I would think that, again, with children, that you would really want to give them a sense of hope and give them things that they can do that provide them with hope. Yeah.
Solution-oriented communication.
Yeah. And you know, and one thing one piece of research that this was with older kids, but we find that older kids can influence their parents and engage their parents, that adults, when the kids come home from school and say, I'm upset about this, the parents then are likely to change themselves in order to help the children. It can pull the parents or push the parents into action. That's not really an answer to the question, but maybe someone speaking this afternoon who is more engaged in education can address that more effectively than I can.
Okay. And Jonathan is asking for a clarification. He says, I'm not sure I understand. Isn't it a good thing that cautious and disengaged groups can easily change their minds?
It would be if they changed their minds firmly, but this is the kind of persuasion that has been happening with those within those groups. I mean, as we've said before, there is movement into the more engaged segments. They do change. But a lot of, for the people who are still there, they change, but then they change again because it's not a real change. It's just agreeing with whatever message you come across. Oh, okay, that's good. But not thinking about it enough in order to really retain or form a real opinion rather than a real understanding. It's just something superficial that is not a deeply held or understood belief.
Great, thank you very much. That is all for the questions for now.
Okay, so now we're going to go on and talk about strategies. We're going to talk first about the audiences in the middle who aren't concerned. Then we're going to talk about skeptical audiences, and finally we'll talk about the alarmed and concerned. Talking just regarding channels and the question that was asked about that earlier. With our groups on the end, we want to find the forums that they're using for information on the issue and reach them through those targeted channels. There's plenty of audience research out there on what those channels are that people who are concerned about climate change, people who are skeptical about climate change, what channels they use, and those are the channels that we go to in order to reach them. And then for the middle segments, we're going to rely more on mass media types of communication, knowing when we use those channels that we will be reaching everyone or most everyone, a much broader audience. But the only way we're going to find the cautious and disengaged, they're not going to read the Sierra Club's magazine. So we're going to need to reach them in the channels that they're using, which are widespread, that have widespread use throughout the population. In terms of attention, what I want to have you look at here for just a second and think about is how long it takes you to understand these two images that I'm going to present to you. The first one is this one. And then the second one is this one. Now, how much cognitive effort did it take? It took zero cognitive effort to get that this is a bear that looks very dangerous. It happens automatically. That is system one automatic processing. This takes a whole lot of cognitive effort to understand. And so much climate communication looks like this. You have to care so much about the issue in order to read all of that and process it carefully and understand and retain it. Only the most alarmed of the alarmed are going to put in that amount of effort. So in our communications, all communications, but especially those communications through mass media, we want to use imagery as much as we can that is simple to process and easily understood with a minimal cognitive effort. NASA's climate change website is terrific. I really recommend it. This 2 images from their images of change, and this white line is a slider bar that goes back and forth. So you can look at Arctic sea ice, what it looked like in 1984 and what it looked like in 2012. That is almost as easily processed as that bear. And you don't have to talk about carbon emissions and CO2 levels in the atmosphere and so on in order to show people what's happening. That makes it easier for those middle segments, but for all of us, because it's true for all of us that this is easier to understand. We want to focus on visual imagery that reaches, is understood, that is easily accessible to the extent that we can. So let's talk specifically about the cautious and disengaged, and a lot of this applies to the doubtful, many of the doubtful as well, and even to some of the concerned. We have had a generation of iconic imagery, species used in imagery for climate change. And I want you to think again of the low SES member of the disengaged. So I'm a single mom, I'm struggling to make ends meet, I'm worried about COVID, I'm worried about my kids going back to school. Will they catch it? Will they bring it home? I'm worried about losing my job. How am I going to pay my rent? I don't have time to think about polar bears. And even for people who do have time to think about polar bears, those people in the middle segments tend not to be engaged by that. Remember the model of risk perception, that the sense of vulnerability. Yeah, polar bears are nice, but that's pretty distant from me. I just don't really, I'm not going to change my life for the polar bears. And this applies also to imagery or stories, information about the impact of people in the developing nations. You and I know that this is a problem largely caused, climate change is, by the actions of the developed nations, and the developing nations are bearing the brunt of it. I feel this strongly. I care about the polar bears. I care about the people in the third world. I care about future generations. But the cautious and the disengaged, a lot of the doubtful, don't. And if we want to engage them with the issue, we need to bring it closer to home. We need to show the impacts that are happening to our community, our nation, to the people who we identify with. These are photos from Santa Rosa, from the fires that burned down Santa Rosa a couple of years ago. Santa Rosa is 150 miles from where I am. And I could tell you that pretty much everyone in California knows that there's a drought happening and that we are facing another terrible fire season, and it's scary. This kind of imagery that brings it closer to home helps to engage people with climate change. However, and this is going back to another question that a student brought up before, many of you may have seen this article. It created quite a stir in my community, both pro and con, the uninhabitable Earth. Terrifying people pushes them into fear control and leads to the kinds of cognitive avoidance that we want not to have happening in the audience. You can communicate threat without terrifying people. I mean, it's scary enough already. Just understanding it, we're talking about engaging the cautious and the disengaged. This, I'm going to use a bunch of examples from this campaign. This was a campaign called Wicked Smart. It took place in Boston on the metro system over a year. And here we have vector-borne diseases spreading. All of the posters in this campaign used ostriches. And, you know, ostriches, the myth that they stick their heads in the sand to avoid danger, right? And in each poster, there is a smart ostrich in glasses, and then some dumb ostriches that very often are voicing skeptic myths about climate change. And they're light. It's a light touch. It's humorous. It makes you smile. And at the same time, it communicates vector-borne diseases are spreading in our area. So you can talk about the threat without terrifying people, and you can then pair that with solutions. This is later, each of the posters appeared for a month on this metro system. And after they went through impacts, then they talked about solutions in terms of actions that locals are taking in order to reduce the threat. So we've got our solution information there following the information on threats. Another aspect of this that I want to point to is the use of social norms. We're going to come back to the ostriches in a second. I love this cartoon. Oh God, here they come, act green. This kind of conscious response to other people's beliefs, behaviors, happens consciously, but to a much greater extent, it happens unconsciously. We respond to what other people think, what we believe they think, and what they are doing, and we adapt ourselves to conform to what is prevalent, what is admired, what we perceive as being trendy. And this, oh, here they come, act green. That's what we want to have everyone doing all the time in the backs of their heads, is at an unconscious level. To the extent that we can communicate what's admirable behavior, as is done here, this is a pretty good idea. Look for Boston's climate leaders. This is norm messaging, as well as providing solutions by showing that this is a good thing to do and you will be admired if you do it. That kind of messaging is very influential. It is more influential, in fact, there's big literature on this, than persuasion. I'm not doing this for the environment. I'm doing this because everybody like me does this. We are herd animals. Another strategy is using narratives. We know that people learn as much from stories as they do from nonfiction content. And the stories can be fictional or they can be real. These pictures are from the village of Shishmaref in Alaska, where the village has to move because of erosion, because of sea level rise. Think about designated drivers, that getting people to designate a driver when they go out drinking, that behavior was spread very widely through sitcoms, Cheers and LA Law and The Cosby Show. And then arousing the audience's curiosity and providing them with surprising facts is another way to get information to stick. So the ostrich campaign began in the first month with the poster that's on the left. Do climate scientists agree that people are causing climate change? People on this call probably know that there is a virtual consensus among climate change scientists, climate scientists, that human-caused climate change is happening. But most people don't know that. So here we have the poster that's up for a month with no answer. Do they agree? And then when you hear the answer, which is in the second month of the campaign, and it tells you about the consensus, that is a very surprising fact that is likely to stick. And we have a body of research showing that when people understand that there is a scientific consensus on climate change, it makes them more convinced that it is real, human-caused, harmful, and it makes them more supportive of policies to reduce climate change. So questions there. And I realize we've got another 20 minutes, right, Alexia?
Yeah, that's about it.
So maybe I'm going to try to be very quick here because I'd like to get through the rest of this if possible.
Okay, we have a couple questions, if that's okay. Sorry, I see my webcam is doing weird lines. One question is from Charles. He asks, in order to determine that climate communication is or has been effective, is there a critical mass already achieved in terms of the number of people in the audience you meet? And if so, how do you rate this?
That is a very complicated question, and I don't have a quick answer to it. I'd like to, if you want to reach out and email me, I will be happy to engage with you on that, but I don't feel like I can address that right now in the time that we have.
The second question we have is from Clément. The science of climate events attribution is still in its infancy. Can it really be mobilized to convince, since it's way more speculative than climate projections?
I think that, I mean, they're getting a lot better at it with attribution. They've made huge progress with that. But all we need really is for people to understand that the climate scientists are convinced that humans are causing climate change. That there is a scientific consensus on that. That one piece of information is very powerful without having to go as far as attributing this particular fire. We just need to know that the scientists say, yes, it's happening, it's going to get worse unless we do something about it.
Okay, thank you. I'll let you finish. We have 15, 20 minutes left.
Okay. All right, so doubtful and dismissive. First of all, there are all of the co-benefits. And if you can communicate specifically about what action that you are interested in based on a co-benefit without talking a lot about climate change or even about climate change at all, great, go for it. That's going to be helpful with the doubtful and dismissive, because so much good stuff happens for our communities if we act on climate change. Besides, we reduce climate change, but also we have all of these other benefits to the people in our communities. Focus there. Second, use sources that the audience trusts. This is Bob Inglis, a very conservative politician from South Carolina. He was in the House of Representatives. He now has this organization called Republic N to engage the eco-right. They target very heavily on college campuses because young Republicans are more reachable than older Republicans. Bob is a great source, and sources like him we need conservative voices, and they do exist. You just have to find them. And then through the faith community, evangelical Christians tend to be skeptical. There's high skepticism among evangelicals. This woman, a lot of you probably know her, Katharine Hayhoe, who is one of the leading climate scientists in the world, lead author in IPCC and reports and the National Climate Assessment in the US. She is also an evangelical Christian who is married to a pastor, daughter of a pastor. She talks about climate change. She can talk about climate change in the language and values of the faith community, of her faith community. And she is just the most effective communicator. Just anecdotally, I will tell you, I have cousins who are climate skeptics on Facebook. They were saying things. I sent them a video of Catherine talking about climate change. And one of them wrote back to me and said, that was really good. Can you send me more? And the other one unfriended me. And that's the challenge of speaking to the skeptics, but she's great. So we want sources like her. And then there was a question about value framing earlier. This is my favorite. There's a small and growing literature in this area. This is my favorite paper. I love the title is Red, White, and Blue Enough to be Green. And they presented the audience. I'm not going to take the time to read all of this to you, but in an online experiment, a liberal framing of climate change that emphasizes harm, care, fairness, justice, show your compassion. We have a photo of a woman cradling a seedling and children watering a newly planted tree. And then we had this, which is the conservative framing that focused on sanctity, patriotism, loyalty to authority. It doesn't address individualism, which the questioner brought up. But it's as close. The people who are strongly individualistic also hold these values. They tend to go hand in hand. And this message, show your love for you love your country, joining the fight to protect the purity of America's natural environment. Show your patriotism. We have a picture of a bald eagle and a flag. And when they looked at, in response to these framings of climate change, this climate change composite is an index of acceptance of climate science. The control group is this group right here. So they heard no message. How much do you accept climate science? The liberals accept it, the conservatives do not. For those that heard the liberal framing of the message, you see strong rejection of that by the conservatives. But for the conservative framing of the message, this is not a statistically significant difference. That the conservatives who heard the conservative framing were as not different from the liberals in their acceptance of climate science. Now, that's great, but we have to remember that this was an online experiment and they were measuring attitudes immediately. Those people went home then. And I bet you a week later, if we asked them again, they would be back to more like this, like where the control group is in terms of their beliefs about climate change. One single message is unlikely to stick enough to change people because we are so tribal in our communities. However, multiple messages from multiple sources over time do change people's attitudes. And what we need is for this effect to happen over and over and over again until it sticks. And I am going to skip the questions on that. I'm sorry, but there's one more question period and you can come back to that when we get there. I just would like to get through talking about the alarmed and concerned. And I'm afraid we're going to run out of time. So with the alarmed and concerned, that's the place where the information deficit model actually works. That when we give people the information, they're going to pay attention and they're going to act on it. And what we know is that the alarmed want to do something that makes a difference. And that works very well in terms of promoting social change, because there is change over time happens along a curve, that you have innovators who adopt any change. So and that's attitudes and that's behaviors. And then people, early adopters, pick it up. And then you get more people, the early majority, and fewer people, and then the people who may or may not ever adapt, so that the proportion of the population gradually increases. Are alarmed are likely to be opinion leaders who fall into this early adopters group. If I were 40 years younger, I'd probably call them influencers. And we want to get them to act as influencers. We want them to act as opinion leaders. This helps them when we help them to understand that they have influence on other people by what they say. That is our best way of getting the cautious and disengaged to engage with the issue. Interpersonal communication is much more influential in changing minds than mass-mediated information. And so the alarmed are our allies, and they want to do something. Many of them feel powerless. We can give them something to do, which is to share what they know with people who are less persuaded. So we're going to encourage our alarmed to act as opinion leaders among their friends and family, and that's going to help us build new social norms. Now, there are educational websites like the NASA website that I showed you a minute ago, and also the beautiful, beautiful website from the National Climate Assessment that have, note, we have graphs, we have data. The people who come and use these websites are many of them are students who are doing school projects, but the alarmed also come to these websites, and we want them to act as opinion leaders to share what they've learned with the people around them in order to overcome the resistance or the lack of interest in their social networks. So the first thing we want to try to do we want to ask them to do is talk to other people. And we're going to reach them through the channels that they use, that the activist organizations. And there are so many of them now. And one in particular that I would recommend very highly that you look at is the Climate Advocacy Lab. A second that is wonderful is Climate Access. Both of those are online communities that provide materials for activists who are working on climate change. And through those organizations, you can then find your alarmed audience in order to reach and engage them. In terms of behaviors, we know the behavior is very contagious. Every time I get on my bike, it increases the probability that someone else will get on their bike. This was a study done of solar panels, showing that when solar panels start going up in a community, the number of solar panels greatly increases. We do what the people around us are doing. We want the alarmed to be the models, and they will then hasten social change by acting as models. And finally, I want to talk just a little bit here about activism, that the alarmed are a huge potential body of an issue public that can push policy forward. You notice only 4% of them say they're participating now in a campaign to convince elected officials to take action to reduce global warming. Quarters say that they definitely would be willing to do that, and a third say that they probably would. So we have 2/3 of the alarmed who are willing to act as activists. One of the things that we know from political science about activism is many people, the way they get involved in activism is by being asked by someone they know to do it. That's like one of the 3 major factors that gets people to take action politically. And what you see here is we have roughly 2/3 of the alarmed who say they'd be willing to volunteer, to donate money, to write letters. Even this bottom action, which is a really costly one personally engage in nonviolent civil disobedience against corporate or government activities that make global warming worse. We have almost 1/3 of the alarmed who say they would be willing to do that if someone they like and respect asked them to do it. And so our job with the alarmed is to activate them in order to get them engaged, give them something to do which will help them with danger control and also will help us as a society by the influence that they can exert on those around them. So now I'll take questions on those past 2 parts, and then I have a 2-minute, we're at 72 minutes.
Yeah, we have 5 minutes left, and we have 2-3 questions.
Okay.
One is about your opinion on a quote. In January 2019, Greta Thunberg did a speech at the World Economic Forum that triggered the Youth for Climate movement around the world. And in this very powerful speech, she said, "I don't want you to be hopeful. I want you to panic. I want you to feel the fear I feel every day. And then I want you to act. I want you to act as you would in a crisis. I want you to act as if your house is on fire, because it is." What did you think of that speech?
She's amazing. And I realize that this conflicts directly with what I've been telling you. It's the forum that she was speaking in that was a good thing for her to do. I'm talking about posters on buses addressing the cautious and the disengaged. I'm concerned about how you reach those middle segments. And Greta is not the person to reach the middle segments. She is the person to reach people, to get people to act who are already concerned, not the people who aren't concerned, because a lot of them are going to react negatively to it. I can give you one example, a very sad example. This is not Greta, this is Bill McKibben, who I think is amazing. Students coming into university in the freshman incoming class were required to read one of his books, and their segments were measured before and after reading the book, and they moved downward in terms of segmentation. They became less concerned about climate change because they were rejecting the argument. He isn't the right speaker for that group. So Greta is wonderful for engaging people to act who are concerned. She is not the person who is going to get the cautious and disengaged to act.
A short little question by Mao. Could we say that innovators are also risk takers?
The innovators, the very first people who adopt something, probably many of them are. I don't know of any research on that, but consistent with what I know about them, probably.
And I think at this point, I'll give you the next couple of minutes to wrap up.
Okay. So just in conclusion, first, you want to know your audience, and then you want to design your messages to meet their informational needs. choose the channels where you're most likely to reach them, use sources they trust, use easily processed content, and employ strategies that are likely to engage their interest and attention. And this is the social marketer's mantra, which comes from my colleague, Ed Maybach, that in order to influence the public, we need simple, clear messages that are repeated often by a variety of trusted sources. And this is our team.
Well, thank you very much for this very insightful talk. I very much enjoyed it. We reached the end of our time, so we're gonna take a couple-minute break now and be back at 11:20. Thank you very much, Dr. Roser-Renouf.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.